I'm Paul Dayton, and welcome to this video. My website is pauldayton.us. This is my first book, Correcting Our Financial Miseducation, Raising the Bar for the Average. Raising the bar for the average, sometimes misunderstood by people. It's not about lifting it so it's out of reach of people. It's about elevating the standard for ordinary, improving improving everybody. The standard of I don't know, decorum and procedure, so that people get into the habit of asking for evidence, sorting through the evidence, and eschewing sort of magical words and sacred chants. And so that's what this book's about. It's about speaking the language of evidence. I'm going to spend a little time today talking about the great failure of socialism, known commonly as the New Deal, and the immediately preceding, some episodes that came just before that. We go through four instances in which there were crises, banking crises, which are as close to 1930 as the early 1960s are to the year 2020. So that they're not cast off irretrievably into the distant past. They are well within the reach of the people who were governors and senators and House of Representative members and so on, the people doing the legislating, things that happened in the early 60s that today's audience will be able to understand or know, things like the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, the space race, the moon missions, the Beatles, things like that are all well known and accessible to today's people. In the same way, there were four crises that were handled in absence of massive government intervention, in absence of the existence of the Federal Reserve Bank at all, which the bankers just privately got together and pooled their money. I mean, think about it. The people who own the businesses, the bankers, don't want their businesses to fail. They know their business is the best, so what they did was they went and fixed it so that their businesses didn't go under. They pooled their money, they gave each other loans, they did what they had to do. These crises were solved in a matter of weeks. Then, during the great failure of socialism, that is government, right? We concentrate power into the hands of the few by decree with the Federal Reserve Bank. And then we concentrate power into the New Dealers, the legacy of Frank Roosevelt. They have the two most cancerous legacies are, number one, the intentional creation of federally dependent special interest groups. And number two, the conversion of the Treasury into a perpetual campaign fund for politicians so they can buy votes of those dependent special interest groups. A real disaster that has not gone away. There's nothing so temporary, there's nothing so permanent as a temporary government program. They use the word emergency left and right. Today the word is crisis. It's the same thing. It's a license to do what they want, to rewrite everything, and they established monopolies that are still with us today. They established counterproductive programs and measures that, again, are still with us today. No private monopoly has ever existed for a century, let alone a decade. I mean, forget it. So we're going to talk about today about the 1920s, which is the era just preceding this. We have the four banking problems that were solved by private businesses in a matter of weeks, absence of government intervention. Then we learn about the 1920s. The 1920s, for some reason, in the folklore business, are painted, with folklore. So we're going to speak the language of evidence to dispel some of that. Read a couple of pages for you today. The 1920s, a template for excellence disregarded. It's important to briefly outline the decade immediately prior to the decade-long economic depression of the 1930s, as it illustrates well an almost perfect contrast of both approaches and of results. The 1920s was a decade marked by relatively low income tax rates, an absence of heavy-handed regulation, comparatively low labor unionization and union power, an absence of federal programs dispensing handouts for the healthy, the so-called safety net. There were no federal minimum wage. There was great industrial progress. There was an increase in real income for all income classes, an improvement in material quality of life for all, but particularly for those in the lowest income classes. In contrast, the 1930s were marked by the opposite approach and of the opposite results. Post-World War I inflation was handled poorly by the newly formed Federal Reserve Board, and the board made a drastic and sudden alteration in rates, as opposed to a slow and gradual alteration, and this drastic shift resulted in a very difficult transition year during 1921. This government induced recession, occurring during the Harding administration, led to 1 in 10 workers losing their jobs. In absence of heavy handed government wage controls or handout programs, firms adjusted by reducing wages. The recovery was swift. By 1923, employment was fully restored. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, one of many measures of the American economy, although not the only measure, was at the level of 88 to 89 during the week in which President Coolidge took over for the deceased President Harding in August of 1923. The Dow would nearly double to 168 by July of 1927, and that level would double to 343 by October of 1929, as Coolidge turned over the party's candidacy for election to Herbert Hoover, the eventual winner of that race. Treasury Secretary Mellon's low tax rates helped to provide the steady growth of the decade, along with the low jobless rates for the workers, as unemployment was a little over 3% in July of 27 and just under 5% in October of 1929. On the topic of taxes, July of 1921 saw the corporate tax rate increased from 10% to 12.5% in July. In 22, President Harding dropped the top income tax mildly from 73% down to 58%, with a further fall to 50% in 1923. The top rate was then cut in half to 25%, with the lowest bracket at 1.5% for the years of 1925 to 1928, and the top rate dropped again from 25 to 24% in 1929. So it's a steady decrease of income tax rates for not only corporate rates, but also personal income tax rates. It is worth noting that the amount of dollars paid by the highest bracket rose from $300 million to $700 million, rising in terms of both total tax revenue collected by the Treasury from roughly 1/3 of total taxes paid during the early portion of the decade to nearly 2/3 of total taxes paid and collected by the later years of the 1920s. So that is, as the income tax rates fell, or even were plummeted, from a level of 73% down to 24%, the amount of dollars brought in grew, and the amount of dollars paid, not only in terms of just dollar value, but also a proportion of the dollars collected. So for every $1,000, the top income brackets at the lower tax rates were bringing in much more of every $1,000 collected by the government. The material quality of life for the masses improved mightily during the 1920s. Indoor plumbing was installed into the homes of the rank and file members of the American populace. Radio was the new technology of the day, a luxury item only for the rich, whoever those people are, which found its way into more and more homes as the decade progressed. In 1925, about 1 of 5 U.S. households had a radio. And by 1929, the proportion of U.S. households with a radio had swelled to about 35 or 40%, as sales of radios in America rose from $60 million worth in 1922 to $842 million worth in 1929. Beginning in the 1910s, the dynamic growth of the new automobile industry, absent rampant overbearing union monopolies, as well as heavy-handed government regulation, brought a trend of steadily decreasing costs for new Model T cars, which accompanied an ever-increasing income for the American workers overall. The number of cars on the road in the United States ballooned from 6.7 million in 1919 to 23 million a decade later. And here we have a little chart, which I don't know if you can read from there. There are many of these, by the way, throughout these books. But we have the average earnings of the worker from the period of 1912 to 1924. It begins at $592 and ends at $1,300, while the price of the Model T Ford in 1912 was $600, and in 1924 was only $290. So people are making more money, the cost of luxuries and new technology is decreasing, things are good. Indoor plumbing came to the masses in the 1920s. What incredible change in life, in quality of life. It's immensely good for the rank and file people. Another noteworthy occurrence in the 1920s, as contrasted with the forthcoming decade and its cancerous economic legacy, which still ails the country to this day, was a triumphant moment in which the Supreme Court rejected a minimum wage law. In 1923, in the case of Adkins versus Children's Hospital, a localized Washington, D.C. measure was struck down by the court on the grounds that such a law infringed upon the individual's civil liberty to contract with one's employer and vice versa. Abolition of minimum wage laws also enabled the least preferred applicants, whether that lack of preferability is derived from a lack of experience, a lack of skill, negative racial, ethnic, religious, or gender prejudices held by a prospective employer, or any other reason, to put themselves on sale in order to enter the job market of a particular field in the first place so that they may prove themselves, just the same way that a new business or a new product is placed on sale in an attempt to induce the customer to give them a chance. A rise in price can come later, after preferability among the customer improves, but at the outset, the plain fact remains that 100% of nothing is nothing, and minimum price laws limit the least preferred to an earned income of nothing. The next section is the late 29 to 1932 period. The Fed, Hoover and Company dropped the ball. To learn more about that, you can pick up your copy of Correcting Our Financial Miseducation, Raising the Bar for the Average. Thank you for joining me today. Check out my website, pauldayton.us, and enjoy your life. Thank you.